Before we go any further, I need you to pause for a second and really hold on to two facts at the same time. Natasha Ryan was 14 years old when she disappeared. Scott Black was 22, not 18 and 20. Not a grey area where someone might excuse poor judgment or youthful stupidity. 14, a child in high school and a grown man with a job, a car, a home, and the ability to make adult decisions. That fact alone should make this case uncomfortable. And if it doesn't, if your first instinct is to wonder what she was thinking or why she chose to stay, that's a problem. Because everything that followed only makes sense once you stop treating this as a quirky mystery about a girl who hid in a cupboard and start treating it as a series of calculated adult decisions made around a child who slowly, deliberately disappeared from the world. Think about 14 for a second. Really think about it. That's year 9. That's worrying about school assignments and weekend plans. That's still being told what time to be home. That's the age where you're not legally allowed to work full-time, get married, vote, drive, or even leave school. So ask yourself this: what does a 22-year-old man want with a 14-year-old girl? Because whatever the answer is, it's never good. If this is your first time here, subscribe now. Not because this is sensational, but because cases like this only make sense when you're willing to sit with the details instead of skipping past them. When you're willing to ask the uncomfortable questions that everyone else quietly ignores. Now, here's what people often miss when they tell this story. Natasha didn't just vanish once. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in a moment of teenage rebellion. She had run away before, twice, and both times police found her in the exact same place, with Scott Black. Each time she was returned home. Each time her parents were relieved. Each time the warning signs were staring everyone in the face. And yet, somehow, when she disappeared again in August 1998, the most obvious possibility that she was with Scott was treated like background noise, a footnote, an unlikely theory that got dismissed early and never revisited. Why? Because Rockhampton had bigger problems. On the morning of August 31st, 1998, Natasha's mother dropped her off at school like she'd done 100 times before. It was the last day of winter, a normal Monday. Natasha got out of the car, said goodbye, and walked toward the building. She never went to class. Witnesses later said they saw her near a cinema in town. There were vague reports, conflicting accounts, confusion. And within weeks, as the search intensified and answers failed to materialize, the narrative shifted from teenage runaway to something far darker. Because Rockhampton wasn't just dealing with one missing girl, Leonard John Fraser was already on police radar. A violent predator, a diagnosed psychopath, women were disappearing, a 9-year-old schoolgirl had been murdered. Blood from another victim was found in his car. And in an environment like that, where a community is terrified, where parents are locking their doors at night, where the media is demanding answers, investigations don't drift slowly toward conclusions. They snap into place. Natasha Ryan became a victim before anyone proved she was dead. She became another name on Fraser's list. Another tragic casualty of a monster who was finally being brought to justice, except she wasn't dead. And here's where the timeline starts to fracture in ways that should bother anyone paying attention. Because while police were building a homicide case, searching bushland, following Fraser's vague confessions, and preparing murder charges, Natasha wasn't buried. She wasn't in a shallow grave somewhere. She wasn't trafficked interstate. She wasn't being held against her will by a stranger. She was alive, living with Scott Black, less than an hour away from the search zone, sometimes just minutes from her own family home. Close enough that if she'd shouted loud enough on the right day, someone might have heard her. For almost 5 years, let that settle for a second. 5 years, not 5 days, not 5 weeks. 5 years of Christmas mornings, birthdays, police appeals, her mother crying on television, a memorial service held in her name. And through all of it, Scott said nothing. And this wasn't hiding in the way people imagine it when they hear the story for the first time. This wasn't someone quietly living under the radar, blending into a new city, creating a second identity. This wasn't witness protection or starting fresh. Natasha's life didn't expand. It shrank. It contracted until it barely existed at all. Heavy curtains were always drawn. Every window stayed covered. Lights were controlled. Noise was monitored. Neighbours were avoided. She rarely stepped outside, and when she did, it was only late at night. A beach? An empty park? always under the cover of darkness, always brief, always careful. By the time police found her in 2003, media reports described her skin as bleached pale from lack of sunlight. She had been outdoors only 6 times in 4 years. Read that again. 6 times in 4 years. Imagine your daughter, or your sister, or your niece spending 4 years seeing the sun 6 times. Imagine what that does to a person, not just physically, psychologically. Imagine the kind of environment where that becomes normal. No school, no friends, no doctor's appointments, no family gatherings, no trips to the shops, no casual conversations with strangers, no moments of spontaneity, no sunlight, no fresh air, no life. Instead, her days were filled with silence, television, sewing, learning German online, exercising indoors, waiting, always waiting, waiting for Scott to come home from work, waiting for visitors to leave, waiting for footsteps to fade, waiting for years to pass. She learned to be invisible, and Scott taught her how. Now, here's the part that people argue over endlessly, usually without ever agreeing on an answer. Was she trapped? Or was she choosing this? It's the question everyone wants to resolve because it makes the story easier to categorize. If she was trapped, she's a victim and we can be angry on her behalf. If she chose it, then she's complicit and we can blame her for wasting police resources. But that binary doesn't work here. Because the truth is messier than that. Natasha would later say, in interviews, in court statements, in moments of painful honesty, that she stayed hidden because she was terrified of the consequences. She believed she'd be sent to prison. She believed she'd be taken away from Scott and locked up somewhere worse. She believed the lie had grown so large, so all-consuming, that there was no way out that didn't destroy her. And maybe that's true. Maybe in her mind, as a 14-year-old girl who'd run away from a fractured home, who'd been struggling with mental health, who'd already tried to harm herself, maybe staying hidden felt like survival. But here's what that explanation conveniently ignores. She wasn't making that decision alone. Scott Black didn't just fail to come forward. He didn't just passively allow her to stay. He actively participated in every single day of that lie. He lied to police. Repeatedly. Directly. Under oath. He signed sworn statements. Legal documents that carry the weight of perjury charges saying he had no idea where Natasha was. That he hadn't seen her. That he hadn't heard from her. That she'd vanished. And he was just as confused as everyone else. He allowed police to search for years. He allowed volunteers to comb through bushland looking for a body. He allowed helicopters, search dogs, forensic teams, investigators working overtime, all searching for someone he knew was alive. He allowed Natasha's family to grieve. He allowed her mother to cry on television, begging for answers. He allowed them to hold a memorial service on what would have been Natasha's 17th birthday, a ceremony where her family said goodbye, where they mourned a daughter they thought was dead. He knew, and he said nothing. But here's the part that should make your blood run cold. He allowed a man, Leonard John Fraser, a serial killer, a diagnosed psychopath, to stand trial for Natasha's murder. Fraser didn't confess out of conscience. He wasn't overcome with guilt. He bargained. He wanted protection in prison. He wanted safety from other inmates. He wanted privileges. And the currency he had to trade was information, confessions, bodies. He told police he'd killed Natasha Ryan. And because police were under immense pressure to close cases, to bring justice to grieving families, to prove they were doing their jobs, they believed him. The system declared Natasha Ryan dead, while she was alive, hiding in a cupboard, in a house less than an hour away. Let that contradiction sit with you for a moment. A man confessed to a murder that never happened. Prosecutors built a case. Evidence was prepared. A trial date was set. And through all of it, Scott Black, the man who knew the truth, stayed silent. That's not fear. That's not confusion. That's not a teenager making a bad decision. That's a grown man making a calculated choice again and again to protect himself at the expense of everyone else. So let's talk about Scott for a second, because he's usually treated as a footnote in this story, the boyfriend, the guy who hit her, a background character. But Scott Black wasn't just present. He was in control. He was the one with the car, the one with the income, the one who left the house every day and interacted with the world, the one who decided when the curtains stayed closed, when it was safe to move houses, when Natasha could step outside. He moved them multiple times over those 5 years, different homes, different neighborhoods, always staying just ahead of suspicion. And every time they moved, Natasha's world got smaller. He controlled access. He controlled information. He controlled her reality. And when things got too risky, when police started closing in, when the walls finally started to collapse, it wasn't Natasha who broke. It was Scott who called it in, April 2003, an anonymous tip. Not because he suddenly found his conscience, not because he couldn't live with the guilt, but because the situation had become unmanageable. Because Fraser's trial was moving forward and the risk of being caught was higher than the risk of coming forward. So he controlled the ending too. Police raided the house and they found Natasha hiding in a cupboard, shaking, terrified, pale as a ghost, still convinced that the moment the door opened, her life would be over. She was 18 years old and the fallout was immediate and frankly insulting. The murder charge against Leonard Fraser collapsed overnight. The Crown had a problem no prosecutor wants to face, a living victim in a murder trial. Fraser would eventually be convicted of other horrific crimes, sentenced to life without parole for the murders he actually committed. But Natasha's case? Gone. Scott Black was charged with perjury. He received a 3-year sentence. He served 1 year. 1 year. For hiding a child for 5 years. For lying under oath. For allowing a murder investigation to proceed knowing it was false. For letting a family grieve unnecessarily. For costing the state hundreds of thousands of dollars in wasted resources. 1 year. Natasha, meanwhile, was fined $1,000 for causing a false police investigation. Think about that for a second. A 14-year-old girl who disappeared, who spent her teenage years hiding indoors, who emerged at 18 with her life in ruins, was fined by the state for wasting their time. And just like that, 5 years of unimaginable isolation, manipulation, and control were compressed into court summaries, tabloid headlines, and a public narrative that treated the whole thing like a bizarre curiosity instead of a safeguarding failure. Here's what never sat right with me. And here's what should bother you too. This wasn't just a teenage mistake that got out of hand. This wasn't a Romeo and Juliet situation where two young people made impulsive decisions and things spiraled. This was a system that failed to protect a child, then failed to question its own assumptions, and finally corrected itself only when the person who'd been controlling the situation decided it was convenient. Natasha would later say, in interviews, in moments where she was clearly still processing the trauma, that she deserved punishment, that she was gutless, that she was ashamed of what she'd put her family through, and maybe she believed that. Maybe she still does. But shame doesn't explain how so many adults, police officers, neighbours, landlords, Scott's employers, people who saw them moving houses in the middle of the night, missed what was happening in plain sight. It doesn't explain how a man could hide a 14-year-old girl in his home for years, control every aspect of her existence, move locations to avoid detection, and still be treated as a secondary figure in the story. Still be painted as the boyfriend instead of what he actually was. And it doesn't explain why we, as a society, are more comfortable calling this case bizarre or unusual than asking whether it was profoundly, inexcusably wrong. Ask yourself this. If this was your daughter, would you accept she chose to stay as an explanation? If this was your sister, would you shrug it off as a quirky story? If this was someone you loved, would you be satisfied with a 1-year sentence for the man who hid her? Because I don't think you would. Natasha would go on to marry Scott Black. They had children together. She trained as a nurse and worked in radiology. She tried, by all accounts, to build a life beyond the label that followed her everywhere. The girl in the cupboard. But the timeline never made sense because the behavior never did. Not from Scott, not from the system that let this happen, not from a justice system that treated a child's disappearance as a minor inconvenience once she reappeared. A 14-year-old girl spent 5 years hidden indoors because a 22-year-old man decided that was preferable to facing consequences. And when it was over, he got a year in prison and she got a fine. That's not justice. That's not accountability. That's a story we still don't want to confront honestly. And that's the part of this case that refuses to stay buried, no matter how many years pass, no matter how much people want to move on. Because it forces us to ask a question we don't like answering. How many other Natashas are out there right now? Hidden, controlled, waiting for someone to ask the right question, waiting for someone to knock on the right door. And how many times will we look the other way because it's easier than admitting we missed it? If you're still here, subscribe, because this story doesn't end with answers. It ends with questions we're still avoiding.